just a few words about myself. I've been working in elections and democracy development for over 10 years already in a number of countries. And I've also been writing about social media development and digital activism in Ukraine. That's where I'm from, and some of the neighboring countries already for 10 years. And one of my personal motivations to do this research was, how to use data in politics in an ethical way. So because I'm pretty sure political parties, political actors will continue, using personal data given all of this technology that's available. So I think the role of the researchers is to understand what's going on. And just one more thing that I want to say on this slide is that below you can see my contact information, my email, and my Twitter account. So I'm really interested in exploring this topic further. So if anyone is interested in collaborating, please shoot me a message. So, Varun outlined some big picture questions about the use of personal data for political persuasion. But in order to answer some of these bigger questions, we really need to know, we first need to understand what is going on. So we need to be able to look into this black box of technologies so that we can make a better judgment and to see how some of these technologies are being applied in our countries, in our political, in our legal, in our social context. And, I don't necessarily believe that, technology is evil or political parties that are targeting you on Facebook or sending you an email messages are, necessarily doing something bad or something wrong. It's just that really there is very little transparency with some of these technologies, and more often than not, very little or no regulations around them. So we just really simply need to figure out what's happening as a first step. Well, the first question is, what exactly do you want to find out and why? What are the specific aspects that you want to look in your research, and why are they important? And in my research, I looked at the use of personal data during the 2019 parliamentary elections, and I specifically focused on the parliamentary campaign and not the presidential. And during that period of time, there were several organizations, civil society organizations in Ukraine that looked into issues like the use of targeted political advertisement on Facebook, or some of the campaign financing issues surrounding the use of these advertisements, and so on. However, no one really looked at the use of personal voter data in elections and the issues arising at the intersection of digital campaigning and privacy. So the purpose of my research was really to fill that gap. And this is the particular issue I focused on. And the next step, of course, is to define the scope and the subject of your research. So whether you're focusing on one country or a number of countries, maybe one region, is there a certain time period that you're looking at? Why is this time period important? I mean, an election period is a natural kind of choice, I think, in these circumstances, but I would imagine that in some contexts, the researchers may choose to focus on something else, like a pre-election period or post-election, depending on what's most important for your context. And then, of course, decide what are the key actors that you want to investigate and why do they matter. And so for me, the motivation or the logic behind choosing the 2019 elections in Ukraine, were the following. First of all, I'm a Ukrainian, so I really think I know what's going on in Ukraine better than in any other place. And moreover, to the best of my knowledge, no such research has been carried out in a Ukrainian context before. So I also felt that this might be a great opportunity, to kind of, with the Ukrainian research to open a sort of gateway into the region, and maybe, to generate some interest and for people to see what's happening in other parts of our region in this regard. And also in 2019, I saw political actors collecting citizens' personal data in all kinds of different ways and using really increasingly sophisticated internet technology. And our legislation is kind of lagging way behind. For example, it doesn't really even distinguish between online and offline campaigning. So I thought that was an interesting situation to look at. And finally, in 2019 and before, Ukrainians have been quite preoccupied with the threat of external interference and disinformation and so on. And hardly anyone looked into, how the domestic political actors are collecting and using citizens' personal data. So I thought that was another motivation to look into this specific aspect. And finally, I focused my research around 5 parliamentary parties, so the 5 political parties that have been elected to the Ukrainian parliament as a result of 2019 elections. It's not that there weren't any other interesting political players that were doing interesting things with personal data and with digital campaign technologies, but it's more that I had to limit my research in some way and set some reasonable boundaries for myself. The next step is to set research questions for yourself, and I have formulated such like loose 4 research questions, I would say. The first one was the use of voter data, the way the voter data was collected and managed by political parties, what tools and methods have been used for online campaigning, and whether and how this personal data had been utilized, and the potential impact of these technologies. I also looked at legal landscape, like what regulations exist around the use of personal data and how did they impact the process. And finally, what are the implications of all of my findings for civil society, including political parties, for voters themselves, and for policymakers. But here I just want to make a short note and say that if you choose to do a sort of exploratory research that I have done, then it's quite okay for some of these research questions to change or evolve throughout your research process, because among your findings, you may stumble upon some leads that will take you in some unexpected directions, and that is okay. And for example, one of the things that I've ended up looking at that I had not anticipated was the relations between political parties and some of the affiliated non-partisan organizations or non-political organizations, and whether there were any data exchanges between, or like data transfers between the two, and how those were, whether these processes have been transparent or not, and so on. And so that's something I didn't expect to look at, but as I was writing my research, I've come across this, and I thought this is very interesting for my topic. So the point is, I guess, is to kind of keep your eyes open, and even if you stumble upon some unexpected information, just keep asking yourself, well, is this relevant, and is it worth being taken further? And you may end up with some interesting findings that you had not expected. And another kind of thought to consider is what information you need to answer your research questions, and whether it's even possible to get all of the data that you need in order to answer your research questions. I mean, this is a bit of a gamble, because you sort of know what information you need, but once you start looking at it, sometimes it's hard to tell whether it's enough or not. So I took a bit of a leap of faith, and here's when I was doing my research, and here's a list of sources that I used. So those I don't think those are all, but I tried to outline as many of them as possible on this slide. So first, I looked at the digital platforms used by the political parties during elections themselves, including websites, social media pages, messengers, chatbots, mobile applications, petition platforms, online questionnaires, emailing software, and so on. I mean, there's a big variety of technologies that the political parties have used for engaging with voters. And of course, I also looked at the websites of some government organizations and and read some laws and so on and so forth. The sources that could be called secondary are media publications and appearances of political party members in the media when they talked about how they ran their campaigns, what technology they used, and so on. Then there's data provided by the platforms themselves, such as transparency reports, ad libraries, etc. In Ukraine, the only platform that opened their political ad library to public scrutiny was Facebook, and no other social media platform provided the same level of transparency, unfortunately. And another big, I would say, advantage to doing research on Ukraine is there are so many organizations that are also looking into the issue of elections, are very, very, very professional and coming up with these great reports, and they're a great resource for anyone who wants to do this kind of research. So I use those for sure, and I even partnered with some of the organizations about which I will speak in a few minutes. And there were also lots of analytical publications that I reviewed when writing my research. And finally, some things that you could also consider conducting personal interviews with people that worked on political campaigns. It may or may not be possible, but this is, of course, probably one of the best ways to learn about the technologies that the political actors employ for campaigning, how they're treating data, and so on. You may also choose to talk to various experts, whether in the field of elections or technology, because they can provide you with some valuable insights. Consider subscribing to some of the digital campaigning platforms that the political actors are using, mailing lists, follow them on social media, etc., etc. This is also really interesting to see how your data is being treated in this context. Of course, if you're comfortable with doing that. And another method is submitting formal requests for information, and this is something that I've done for my research together with one of my collaborators, and this was also very useful. Once you formulate your research question, you kind of know what's the scope of your research, what the sources of information that you're going to use, how do you go about conducting such research. And here I tried to outline kind of loosely or roughly the steps that I took when I was doing research on Ukraine. So at first, I gathered some initial data, mostly from my primary sources. So I looked at the data collection and management practices used by political parties on their official online platforms. I looked at all kinds of digital campaigning methods and tools that were utilized during the elections. And I also asked such questions about, the personal data that's being used for this campaigning. Where could it plausibly come from? And then I kind of reviewed those findings against the claims that parties made themselves about how they're using the data, whether in the media or, like privacy policies on their websites. I also reviewed it against the existing legal framework, the data provided by social media platforms, Facebook in my case, and the reports of some of these watchdog organizations. And I basically looked for any kind of inconsistencies or some interesting aspects, when comparing the two. And that's something that took me further, my next step. And my next step was I was trying to contextualize all of this information that I found. So basically, I used background on political parties and political environment, and some of the specific challenges, interesting aspects of the 2019 election campaign or election cycle. I looked at the development and application of digital campaign technologies in Ukraine at that point, and also at the state of personal citizen data security in Ukraine overall, which turned out to be a very interesting topic and something that certainly deserves to be explored further. And finally, in the end, I had to ask myself, what does it all mean? And I think this is the answers to these questions are kind of, it's an ongoing process coming up with the answers to this question. And of course, as any research, if you do this kind of research, you will have some limitations, and I had some limitations. And I think it's just important to be open about what those are, especially when presenting your findings. And this is a list of limitations I had to consider. So, I did not have any backend access to parties' websites or campaign software or social media pages. So there's only a limited kind of conclusions that I can draw about what exactly they did and how exactly they treated the personal data of the voters. Then there's, of course, a limit to the number of platforms that you can reasonably review. I mean, I ended up looking at the official campaign pages of, on social media of political parties and their official websites. And it was physically impossible to look at every social media page of individual candidates, for example, because there are just so many of them, or their websites, and so on and so forth, or every method every candidate used for data collection. And basically, I decided not to provide any kind of systematic review of those, and just included them in my findings where it was necessary to kind of draw a bigger picture. Then there's some limited access to the inside information that we discussed. I happened to do my research during the time of the quarantine, so that impaired my ability to interview people that I had hoped to, interview for my research. Yes, I was able to conduct some of the interviews remotely, but not as many as I planned or hoped. And other limitations, of course, include the actual data that's revealed by the online platforms and the time limitations for which the data is available. For example, while with websites and web pages, you can sometimes go back and look at the archived versions. With social media, it's virtually impossible to do that, for example, on Facebook. I mean, going backwards on Facebook feeds for weeks and weeks, it's very, very complicated. And even if you're using some sort of specialized software to scrape Facebook data, it's still quite difficult to do that. So, so those are some of the limitations that you might want to consider when you're doing this kind of research. And another aspect, and I think this is related to a bit to the question about how to involve data scientists in this kind of work. I mean, we are never experts in everything, so I thought it would be good to engage some people who possess these particular skills in my research. And so here's a list of my collaborators. So I encourage you to collaborate with other people if you decide to do research on this topic. And what I want to say is think about some legal and security considerations. The use of data in politics is a sensitive issue and sensitive topic. So consider how you would deal with the ethics and legal regulations around open source investigations. Because, for example, if you're using someone's Facebook post, even if people post it publicly, if you're using it in your findings, the person that wrote something may not have expected for their post to end up in some kind of formal research, and you may find yourself thinking of how ethical it is to use something like this, and asking yourself whether you need to ask this person's permission to use their Facebook post, even if it's public, especially if they're talking about some sensitive issue. Also think about legal regulations around the kind of information that's openly available on the internet. Sometimes information that, even though it's openly available on the internet, it did not end up on the internet in a legal manner. So that is also something to think about. The second important topic, I think, is physical and digital security of yourself and your sources. So as I mentioned, I ended up doing a lot of my research during the quarantine. So I did some of my interviews, well, all of my interviews actually, remotely. So there was some thought into what would be the safest tool to use to interview people remotely. And also, depending on the subject of your interview or the topics of the interview, for example, I had cases when people would not want to go on the record with the information they told me, or go on the record but not have the information they give me be attributed to them necessarily, and so on and so forth. So these are also some of the things that you need to think about when when you're interviewing sources for this kind of research. Think about how to work around how to work with possibly politically and legally sensitive research findings. And as I mentioned, I had legal advice from Vita, and a couple of times I consulted with her about some of the more sensitive things that I found in the course of my report writing. It's very useful to make sure that you don't just screenshot something, but you archive some of your digital findings properly, because later you may need to retrieve this information, the information in which you base your findings. So it's very good to know how to save it properly. The last thought, I think, or the last question to ask yourself is how to work with final product, or what will be the final product of your research, and how will you go about disseminating it. So I wrote a report, and I know how many of us feel about written reports, but my only excuse here, I guess, is that I thought my target audience were political actors, civil society activists, and policymakers who would be more or less used to this kind of format, and therefore I chose to write a report. But I think that perhaps there are more engaging formats, presentations, I don't know, videos, etc., that you can that you can utilize in order to disseminate your findings better. This is basically all that I wanted to say about, my experience with researching this subject. I just want to say that Ukrainian country reports will be published online shortly in both English and Ukrainian. and it will be available on Tactical Text website and on the websites of my collaborators. And thank you very much.